So I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to address this very interesting symposium. My task was to talk about the use of nicotine to help smokers quit. And let me start with the usual declaration of interest. I have no links to any tobacco or e-cigarette manufacturers. My research into these matters has been funded by all these august public bodies. I'm going to talk about things which are more theoretical and sort of looking at the field from the distance. I'll cover 2 episodes in the story of trying to give smokers nicotine. To help them avoid smoke-related death and disease. The first chapter was the launch of nicotine replacement treatments. And the second chapter, many years later, is what we are going through now with consumer products which are aiming to do the same thing. You may all know this story of nicotine replacement treatments. Ove Feino, a scientist with a pharmaceutical company in Sweden, came up with the idea that if you give smokers nicotine, it may help them to stop smoking. He was alerted by a friend of his to the fact that submarine crews, Swedish crews who couldn't smoke, resorted to oral nicotine. And the same for air crew, actually. And that generated the idea that, right, so they want nicotine, they don't have to smoke, and of course, nicotine on its own is much less damaging. And so he came up with the idea of giving them nicotine through some other route without tobacco, and that's how nicotine chewing gum came about. He developed a gum which would deliver nicotine to bloodstream in 1971. The first paper on this was 73. Mike Russell got involved, and you may have heard that name. There was a Mike Russell oration. He was a scientist in London, and he demonstrated the uptake of nicotine from these products into bloodstream and the effects on withdrawal symptoms, cohort studies of smokers, and eventually with Martin Jarvis and Martin Raw, the first studies, randomized studies showing that this approach helped smokers quit. The gum was approved in 1980. In the US 4 years later. The US seems to be always a bit behind the UK in these matters, not in other matters, but in this definitely. And you may notice that it took some 10 years from the product being developed to be launched on the market. That was, you may think that's a long time, but it was remarkably fast. Nowadays, it would be at least twice as long. Much less radical medical improvements take much longer. Our National Institute of Health Research estimates that from the moment you get a pivotal study published, that's randomized controlled trials which show that a drug works, to get it on the market is 17 years. And of course, from the moment you develop the drug, getting it to testing on animals and then humans and then randomized controlled trial and getting it published, that will be another 15, 20 years. So the research in medicine is developing extremely slowly, and if this was another talk, I would tell you about largely pointless regulation, which is responsible for this. It just shows you my grumpy nature here. Now, the first reactions to this idea of giving smokers nicotine was a surprise and astonishment and alarm. Isn't it like giving alcohol to alcoholics? You won't help people stop using addictive drug, and you're giving them the addictive drug. Doesn't it enhance rather than curtail nicotine addiction? And of course, possible dangers and children. Nicotine chewing gum was the first nicotine replacement product, and it's clearly targeting children, and so there were all these concerns raised at the time. And manufacturers handled it very well. There was a strong medicalization, numerous caveats. It was prescription only. You can only use it when you stop smoking to avoid overdosing. The dosing was terribly low, but that had sort of political placating effect. So the sound bite was you're only getting half the nicotine you get from cigarettes here, and not the other dangerous chemicals. But the fact that you're lowering nicotine dose seemed to have been important. There's no reason to lower nicotine dose, and it would be much more effective if the nicotine dose was higher. But that was possibly a sacrifice worth making. Consumption limit, you can only use 15 pieces of this gum a day, not anymore, and so on. There were also dozens of randomized controlled trials funded by the company who produced nicotine replacement treatment, then independent researchers did it as well. And it just led eventually to these products being accepted as safe and effective. Some other key additions, while I'm talking about the history, the patch was launched in 1991, so there was a long period of time between one product and the next. And that was a different company from the one which launched the first product. And then there was one other interesting development, the nasal nicotine spray, because that delivered nicotine faster than through the buccal mucosa, through the lining of your mouth, or through the skin. But there was a price to pay. This was aversive. And so people had to overcome this initial unpleasantness. Then it was more effective than the other products, but that was actually outweighed by the fact that most people were not willing to take something which initially was unpleasant. After that, everything returned back to buccal absorption and basically modeling the pharmacokinetic profile of nicotine absorption from nicotine chewing gum. Now, health scares emerged at the time, similar to what we have now, but it didn't take root. So there were case studies of people who suffered myocardial infarction while having a patch or chewing a gum. They were smokers for 40 years. They have a cardiovascular disease, but it was still assigned to the nicotine replacement. And all these things which Neil went over about blood pressure, heart rate, endothelial dysfunction, and so on. There were concerns about what happens if you use it for more than 3 months. Oral cancer risk was also written about. But at the time, there were a limited number of people who really were vigorously opposed to this. Media were not all that interested. Pharmaceutical companies handled it very well. And eventually, objective studies and common sense prevailed. And as I said, NRT has been generally accepted, or practically universally accepted, as safe and effective. Now, why didn't the companies develop something more effective? These products are effective, but the efficacy is very low. I can only guess. I don't know what exactly their thinking was. It could have been very difficult to come up with faster nicotine delivery, but actually it isn't. We know that, for instance, a modification of nicotine inhaler, which in the classical form delivers very little nicotine very slowly, but if you put several of these cartridges together and inhale through that, you get much faster and much bigger nicotine hit. But the companies wouldn't want to go that way. Licensing new products via what's called bioequivalence is easy, because you say this is exactly like nicotine chewing gum, and then you don't have to go through all that difficult process we were discussing. So that may be one of the main reasons there. Perhaps also a fear that if there was a product which is much more effective, much more appealing, then non-smokers could pick it up, and it could trigger this backlash we see with the second wave of nicotine replacement products. So we're now in chapter 2 of this story, and we now have a better product that actually has a population appeal and could, in theory, work on scale large enough to eradicate smoking. So this is not just helping a few percent of smokers quit. We have something which may actually remove smoking-related death and disease. However, there's a cost. It would maintain nicotine use in the population. And it's quite likely that if it's effective enough and really mimics what cigarettes do for people, you will get non-smokers picking it up and becoming lifetime nicotine users. And that triggers a very strong feeling and backlash. And also this time, the pharmaceutical industry is not on the side of the angels, but rather opposed to this new development. And the old objections are now revived, and some new objections are generated as well. Nicotine itself has become a major risk, particularly this adolescent brain issue. And I hope we'll have some time in the discussion to hear from Neil more about it. Over decades of careful examination of health risks of smoking and wide publicity of this, adolescent brains never came to it. It was, lung cancer, heart disease, lung disease, but it now dominates the discourse. Suddenly, the damage to adolescent brain is the main risk of smoking and of nicotine devices. And because it's such an important issue and because it's such a dramatic, big effect, it justifies denying smokers an easy way out of smoke-related death and disease, because we need to protect children from this danger. But the claim is based on animal studies, two types of animal studies. One's concern animals which are dosed with very high, actually close to lethal doses of nicotine continuously through very early in their life. And of course, it damages the animals in a number of ways. And this has unclear relevance for what happens when people smoke. And then you've got this gateway experiment where mice, this is by husband and wife Kendall's, a very influential study, mice on nicotine for 7 days, when they were then given nicotine and cocaine for 4 days, they tried different schedules. 1 day on nicotine, it didn't work. 7 days of nicotine did. Then they go to the chamber where they get cocaine more often. And that can be interpreted as nicotine somehow enhancing the attractiveness of cocaine. Of course, there are a number of different explanations of it. We know that nicotine in these animals causes nausea, and they're unwell, they're actually poisoned. They can't vomit, unlike humans. So these animals may have appreciated cocaine more because it somehow alleviated the aversive effects of nicotine. It could be whatever. But it's a long jump to say that this shows that if you give adolescents nicotine, they will become cocaine addicts. But that's more or less how it's interpreted. And yet, we do have evidence that this is not happening. The prevalence of smoking among young people in the United States and Europe declined about 5-fold over the past 50 years or so. And so if nicotine was increasing the probability of cocaine intake, you would see that. There would be a decrease in cocaine addiction. And there is, of course, no sign of that. But generally, about this adolescent brain damage, there's plenty of humans using nicotine, and there is some place where we can look. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist. It may well exist. But we could look at the humans. We don't need this rather far-fetched animal analogs. So where should we look? Well, we have a number of countries where only adolescent males smoke. In China, much of Asia, much of Africa, there's a huge gender difference in smoking rates. And then there are other countries where there are no such differences. So in countries where you have all these young males smoking and no young women smoking, if it somehow affects mental health, you would see that difference there and not see them in the other countries. And it should be relatively easy to look at. And the other way we can look at it is what I already mentioned, this dramatic decline in young people smoking over years. And you could then track whether there are changes now in depression, schizophrenia, antisocial behavior, or whatever is meant. By the way, people who talk about this adolescent brain are always very vague about what exactly they have in mind. Are we talking about schizophrenia? Is it about antisocial behavior? Is it about drug use? What actually is it? What do they mean by this adolescent brain damage? But anyway, I hope somebody will have a look and actually publish these things. Do we see on population scale the effect of smoking on these other things? Because we have these two clear ideas where we should see it if it exists. Now, back to what's supposed to be the core of my talk, which is whether nicotine helps smokers. And there has been these 3 ideas that it actually doesn't promote it in the past, and they are revived again. And so I'll cover them one at a time. So there are people who say if somebody switches from smoking to vaping, they didn't really stop smoking, or they didn't really quit. They remain hooked on nicotine. And this is, of course, nonsense. The rational goal of tobacco control is to avoid smoke-related death and disease. Whether people continue to enjoy something or not is neither here nor there. The question is the health risks of these things. And somebody who stopped using combustible tobacco, of course, stopped smoking. They stopped smoking. In the trial we recently published, which compared nicotine replacement treatment and electronic cigarettes, a large proportion of people who successfully stopped smoking with e-cigarettes continued to vape 1 year later. 80% of them vape. Here are some figures which were not in the original paper, so you get at least some factual information in this musing of mine, that not all of them were vaping nicotine e-cigarettes. About a third were now using nicotine-free, but the rest were still using nicotine ones. Now, that would be bad if there was a health risk, and there probably is, not massive one, but there is, but you have to do it for decades to see that risk, and if they didn't vape, they would avoid that risk. But on the other side, it helped them stop smoking. It most likely prevents relapse. We know that from people who use nicotine replacement treatment, at 1 year they are less likely to relapse. Prevented weight gain to a large extent, prevented them feeling miserable for a long period of time, some of them, and may maintain some enjoyment or whatever other reinforcement they used to obtain from their smoking. So these two sides need to be balanced. There is then the issue of e-cigarettes actually undermining quitting. And you have people who, with serious face, will tell you e-cigarettes not only don't help smokers quit, they actually make it more difficult to quit. This is based on a paper by Kalkoran and Glantz, which put together several studies, and some of them showed that people who failed to quit with e-cigarettes would still be less likely to quit a year later than other people. But that's simply because this is a self-selected group who just demonstrated that they are no good at quitting, so they will remain no good at quitting a year later. But we have massive evidence now that giving nicotine to smokers helped them. There's over 130 randomized controlled trials of nicotine replacement treatments, and e-cigarettes and the other alternative nicotine products are just a form of nicotine replacement treatment. There's no reason why they shouldn't work when nicotine replacement treatments work. We have massive population data, which I won't have time to go over, which show that people are quitting with e-cigarettes. And we now have also randomized controlled trials actually with e-cigarettes showing the same thing. Nevertheless, there is one trial which is being quoted as showing that e-cigarettes don't work. And so I don't know how much time, do I still have time? 2 minutes now. Okay, so I'll skip that one trial and you can look it up on the slides later on. But it's being used to claim that e-cigarettes don't help, but it actually doesn't show any such thing. So the final thing is that many of the people who try to quit with e-cigarettes will become dual users. Not all of them quit. Not all of them abort e-cigarettes. Some will now use both. And the anti-vapers would say they now have the worst of both worlds. They have all the risks of smoking and all the risks of vaping. And it's a bad thing if you have dual use. Now, it's true that dual users maintain their nicotine intake. As Neil was describing titration of nicotine intake, this is a real phenomenon. But they reduce other toxin intake, provided they vape regularly. Of course, if somebody vapes once a week, that won't affect their smoking. But among dual users who vape regularly, you have a significant decrease in toxin intake. So there is a definitive harm reduction just from dual use. And it doesn't detract them from quitting. It may, if anything, improve their chance of quitting in the future because they're using the product which keeps improving. So if what they have at the moment is not sufficient enough to help them quit, the next generation of the product or trying a better e-liquid or trying a different flavoring or stronger concentration will eventually move them along that line, which is more likely scenario than that it somehow undermines their quit attempt. So in summary, in my last minute, when nicotine replacement treatments came about, they faced objections, scares, concerns, but evidence and common sense prevailed fairly quickly and decisively. This time around, we have something much more important. The nicotine replacement treatments, I don't know if you heard about the Eurobarometer data, which monitors smoking behavior in Europe. Only 7% of quitters, people who used to smoke and successfully quit in Europe, did so with medications, including varenicline, bupropion, nicotine replacement treatments. And of course, at least half of them would quit anyway. So these products did not really make a big dent in smoking prevalence. They did help a lot of smokers quit, but in terms of big picture and smoking prevalence, they didn't really do that much. Now we have something which in theory could actually not just reduce smoking prevalence, it will remove smoking prevalence. So a tremendously important potential gain for public health, but it's facing much stronger agendas. Powerful players like WHO and FDA are trying very hard to stop the progress of the thing. And I can't finish with a positive message like saying it's only a matter of time when common sense and evidence wins again. I think this is going to be a long struggle and much harder than it was the first time around. Thank you for your attention.